So let's get into this. This is I still kind of can't believe that this is our 52nd one of these webinars. You'd think I'd run out of topics, and in a certain way, as some of you who've been to many of these sessions probably recognize, we kind of do the same topic over and over again. It tends to be about performance thinking and our models and how we approach performance with different applications. So there's always some level of reviewing the models and such, because I never assume that people have attended multiple ones of these sessions, although clearly there are some regulars. But anyway, today I wanted to talk a little bit about change management and how we think about it through the lens of performance thinking. Um, Part of it is because before I ever really even learned much at all about anyone else's implementation planning or change management methodologies or models, I always thought of our performance thinking framework as an implementation planning and change management framework. I Do you need to click start broadcast on your side? Maybe you do. I'm not on your side, so I don't know. But thanks, Stephanie, for the comment. Anyway, what I was going to say is a lot of the work that I've done over the years, it's stunning, but probably 30 years playing with these models and such, or more, has actually been about making things happen and then sustain. And you can call that implementation planning or change management. As you'll see, I've tended to mush them together. Some people think of them as quite distinctive, but that's kind of where this came from. And it occurred to me that it would be of some interest to just talk a little bit about it. Now, this doesn't get recorded, as I think people know, and we do put it up on YouTube. So if you're watching the recording of it, of course, I'd love it if you would like and share this and make comments, because that gets us more attention and more interest from others. Our YouTube channel is conveniently at a URL, performancethinking.tv, and we've got 52 recorded webinars now and a bunch of other stuff. And you can also get study guides for a few of them with that QR code. We've sort of not gotten back to producing them, but some folks have told me that they get together with groups occasionally and watch these and have discussions about them. Now, next month will be an interesting topic, I think. I've been asking for years about to what extent in business schools is what we know from human performance improvement or human performance technology, or however you want to frame it, how is that taught, or if it's taught? I've tried, for example, to get involved with the business school at my alma mater, my college alma mater, Seattle University, and there's really no place there where explicitly what we know about performance improvement fits. And I've been doing a little bit of investigation in the last few weeks using ChatGPT and some other resources to see what university programs and MBA programs do cover in any way what we think of as performance improvement. And I've discovered that some do. Some of them as electives, some of them in the context of things like Six Sigma or process improvement. But I wanted to explore that a little bit. And so that's what next month will be a bit about. And of course, I'm hoping to get something recorded so that we can send it out to business schools and get them interested in our work. We also, of course, in the shameless commerce mode I am at this moment, have our open practitioner program. And we do it about 4 times a year. The next one is starting this next Monday, and it's already quite filled up. But we have one starting September 15th if anybody's interested, and you can get all the information through that QR code. And so here's the agenda. I want to sort of take you through the logic of today. I want to talk a little bit about, sort of what do we mean even when we use the words change management and implementation planning? Because people, mean different things with these words. And I've always tended to mush them together, as I mentioned, but there are some distinctions to be made, I think. And then in general, when you're implementing a new thing, a process, a system, a policy, whatever it might be, and you're wanting to sustain like what can go wrong? What are some of the things that have come up? I've done a little bit of investigating about what typically goes wrong, and probably most people here have had experience with those things. Um, then we'll talk about, just list a lot of the models and methods, but ADKAR from ProSci is one of the most widely recognized and simple framework to talk about. So I sort of, we're going to talk a tiny bit about that, or at least use it as a kind of a launching pad for having this discussion. And as those of you who know about ADKAR, which is an acronym, the R stands for reinforcement. So what does that mean? And of course, some of you have a background in behavior science, so you may have a different, slightly different definition. And then I want to talk at a very high level about how the models of performance thinking, we think, can allow you to plan for, to both establish, you might say implement, and also sustain new performance in an organization where change management is an issue. Give you one simple example, not in much detail, but it'll give you the way we think about it, and then hopefully we'll have some time to talk. So one of the questions that comes up is, as I say, I've historically tended to put these two things kind of in the same bucket. And so I just thought I'd ask ChatGPT, my current best friend, when it comes to searching about information that's not just a simple word check. And so I wanted to see what it said. Are they the same or different? In what ways are they different? Well, implementation planning, as some people define it, is a technical exercise. It's about, let's say, it's about a system or a process of some kind. It's about being sure the thing happens and works, or at least works. So it's ensure that the solution works properly. If it's a piece of software, for example, it involves typically all the kind of pre-work of project planning and assigning tasks and, creating Gantt charts and all the rest of it and making the thing happen. So you're sure that whatever it is you're going to implement, whatever the change is or the new thing is, that it works. On the other hand, change management, as ChatGPT describes it, is the people side of change. So it's, we can have a great system. As they say, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. So, well, how do we ensure that users adopt a change effectively? How do we communicate about that in a way that's useful? And of course, in change management, communication plans are one of the big things that people talk about. How are you going to roll it out to everybody so everybody's on board, so everybody knows what's going on, and also so everybody's interested, really wants to engage. And so those are the ways that people make that distinction. And the question really I have about that is, aren't those two things, as defined by those phrases, kind of two parts of the same process? Because you can set up a system or whatever the thing is and be sure it works, but if you don't ensure that people use it, what's the point? And you can try to get people to do a new thing, but if the thing doesn't work, then that's not going to be very useful. So to me, I've always thought of these as parts of the same process. Now there's a bunch of things, if you look up like what are the kinds of problems that people have? What are some of the preventable problems? And this is a short list, but I did a little bit of looking, and I'm sure you all probably have some things you could add to this list. But so what are the kinds of things that are preventable? Like the objectives are unclear for whatever the thing is that you're implementing. Organizational strategy and alignment with the project itself are maybe not so well defined or a little fuzzy, like why are we doing this again for the sake of the whole company or organization? Inconsistent leadership support. You got people in one group who are really supportive and other people who say, oh, okay, well, maybe. Or limited middle management buy-in. That's in many ways even worse because that's closer to the work. In general, poor communication. The no attention to emotional impact is an interesting one because, of course, change is difficult. And when we think about values, when we think about motives or preferences, a lot of times those are affected by how you feel about this change. Wait a minute, we've been doing this forever. Why do we have to change this? That kind of thing. Lack of follow-up, lack of even responsiveness to feedback from users or participants who say, well, wait a minute, we need to change this. Failure to measure and adjust. If you don't measure the thing in some way, how do you even know if it's working? and then the thing itself, which kind of goes back to the implementation planning category. A lot of times people try to implement systems that are hard to use. I have some colleagues, for example, in the behavioral health world, in the autism industry, if you will. And there are a few major systems, but one in particular that will go unnamed, but it's a big practice management system. It has kind of everything from soup to nuts in it. And I've spoken with a couple of my, very experienced colleagues about this. And what they say is, once you get up to speed on this thing, it'll do anything you could possibly want in your organization in terms of managing data and patient care and records and all that stuff. But it's a bear to get up to speed. It's hard. So that's a challenge. That's an obstacle. Or people don't even recognize when others are doing the right thing. They don't even say, "Hey, good job," or timelines that are pressed, et cetera. So these are some of the things that tend to come up. And we could spend some time just analyzing these and what the issues are. But those of you who know about the 6 boxes model probably recognize that there's a place for these things in that framework. Now, here's some of the common change management models and methods. I looked this up, and that QR code goes to a whole list of them. And, a bunch of them, ADKAR, which we're going to talk about and sort of pick that one. But there's some methodologies or models that sort of step you through a change process. There's folks that are much more technical in their orientation. There's the change curve, the Kubler-Ross thing, which is interesting. It sort of reflects the stages of grief in some respects when you're changing things. PDCA cycle is really just systematic, continuous improvement. So there's a bunch of them. But ADKAR, I just thought I'd pull out just to look at because it's explicit and most people know about it. So here's a summary, as you saw on the front page, of this high-level view of what's involved. So awareness, you want to be sure that people know what's going to happen and why, and you want to give them an opportunity to engage. So you find out, what their questions or challenges or problems might be and how you can address those. And then you want to move forward with that to figure out that desire, like, what do people think about this and this change? And we're starting to do it maybe. And so what's that about, and do people care? And then often we talk about champions, and we also often talk about change agents, people who we know are well respected, who are into it, who will become models to other people and influencers. And then also the whole process is, if there is resistance, addressing those things and how it's going to make a difference for people, the individuals. And then, of course, the knowledge phase or category, if you will, is really about being sure people know how to use whatever the thing is and they know what they have to know. And you could probably throw skills in there too. Says address any skill gaps. And you can provide resources and essentially get people up to speed in a certain way. I would say that is part of the implementation thing, really. And then ability. To me, that is not well distinguished from knowledge, but it's a category. So it's about being sure people can do it, and that there's actual practice, and you can actually monitor whether people are doing okay. And we have some goals for this, and we're going to adjust this to be sure people really can do this thing. And then R for reinforcement, and that's the one I want to jump into a little bit more detail, because the way they frame it is monitoring the change over time to ensure it fulfills your desired outcome, and then use positive feedback, rewards, and recognition to encourage it. So the ADKAR folks, and again, I suspect maybe if we have a few minutes at the end, Scott may have some reflections on this, or anybody else might too. But to me, that reinforcement part, there's a lot implicit in there that's really not quite. It's not as clear as it could be. Let's put it that way. So that's why I asked the question, what is reinforcement? Now, I have a background in behavior science, and a bunch of other people here do too, I can see, in the group that we have. You were trained in one way or the other in applied behavior analysis or some version of behavior science. And technically, in Skinner's Natural Science of Behavior, the word reinforcement means an event, usually thought of as a consequence, that comes after behavior, which increases the strength or likelihood of that behavior. So with that framework, certainly the ADKAR definition of reinforcement makes sense. It's doing stuff that makes it likely that people will do and continue to do the thing. But in change management, it's described a little bit more broadly. Actions taken to maintain and sustain desired behaviors after an initial change is implemented, ensuring that new ways of working become ingrained in the organization's culture and continue to be followed long term. Now, that sounds a little bit more than just recognizing when people are doing the right thing. And so, what I would like to say is whether we call this reinforcement or something else, I think it's about establishing and configuring a performance system, all the whole context in which whatever this thing is going to happen for optimal ROI. In other words, to be sure that it's really used and it's used efficiently and effectively. And it also sets it up for continuous improvement, since very seldom, as I think everyone in this group will probably agree, when you do any kind of intervention, you get it 100% right off the bat. So you usually want to have an opportunity to continuously improve. So that's where I land with this notion of reinforcement. And what I'd like to do is to dig into that a little bit from a performance thinking perspective. So as many of you know, performance thinking is accomplishment based. And Tom Gilbert, one of our mentors and one of the people who really changed the world in a certain way by saying this, that in the great cult of behavior, by which he meant everybody pretty much, leaders, managers, training people, anybody that's involved with human performance. He says, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, people are probably going, oh, geez, we've heard Binder say this like 400 times, because I probably haven't given a presentation for 20 years and didn't have this in it. And we call accomplishments work outputs. And the reason we do that is because people have different ideas about what accomplishments mean, and I don't want to argue with them, but what we mean is countable things that have value and are the products of behavior. They're not just the completion of behavior. And Gilbert had this, I think, rather cool, at least conceptual formula or equation. And you can actually turn it into a mathematical thing too if you want. But even if you just think of it conceptually, the notion that the worth of an intervention, let's say a new system or a new policy that you're implementing, is equal to the value of the accomplishments that it increases or enables people to produce, divided by the cost of the behavior. So if we're doing change management, or if we're doing implementation planning, and we're implementing some new fancy system that costs us a ton of money and takes a lot of time to implement and configure and all the rest of it, that time and that money is in the cost category. And so we hope that there'll be more widgets produced as a result of it, or more customer solutions provided, or a more rapid processing of paperwork, or more effective resolution of human resource problems. Whatever the thing is, we hope that the value of accomplishments will be increased beyond the cost of behavior. And so in modern terms, of course, we call that return on investment. So we're kind of starting from that perspective, that whatever we're doing when we're implementing or changing something, whether it's something at kind of a cultural level or a very operational level or someplace in between, that we want to be sure that it delivers value greater than the cost to do it. And so what I would say then, just to summarize, is that the goal of change management and or implementation planning is to create or increase value by whatever it is you're implementing. Now, you all know this little model probably, and if you don't, it's pretty simple. It's the first of our two models. We call it the performance chain, and it's just a simple way of talking about what the elements of performance, the units of analysis, if you will, and we anchor all of our analysis to work outputs. So, of course, it works from left to right, and but we analyze it, as we'll talk about in a couple minutes, about the logic, from right to left. But the anchor is in the work outputs, because what we care about is the delivery of, or the production of, those deliverables or valuable transactions or decisions or milestones or those other kinds of work outputs or accomplishments that have value to our organization because they contribute to business results and are produced by behavior, which we can define. So that's how we start in our analysis, and we look for outputs in a lot of ways. This is, many of you are familiar with this probably. It's a version of an organizational relationship map, and you probably can't even quite read it because it's rather tiny print. This happens to be some years ago. It's the company's even changed its name, but a not-for-profit that works with people with disabilities. And within the gray box are all the departments and groups and teams inside the organization. And then outside of it, there's people like of course, the customers, but regulatory entities, the suppliers, and so forth. So this is, I always like to say, is a picture of how the whole machine works. And I think Gary Rumler was really the originator of this way of thinking, but we've got behavioral systems people in that category and other folks who have tended to want to look at sometimes the whole organization and how it works. And when you look at that, you see along those arrows that there are things that these different departments or groups move around. They send each other. They might be data, they might be widgets, they might be orders, they might even be people, but they are outputs, if you will, exchanged between the functions and groups there. So that's an organizational level way of finding work outputs. Of course, this is a simple process. It has 3 performers, and the boxes, as with most process maps, have activity, create draft content specification, implement review comments, et cetera, et cetera. And the things that are circled are the outputs. They're the things that each of those steps produces. So people here are quite familiar with this, I'm sure. And a lot of implementation planning and change management happens around new processes or revised processes. And then this is a tool that we've kind of developed and evolved over the years called Individual Performance Map. Interestingly, this happens to be of a chief learning officer in a bank, a specific man who I knew some years ago. And he was actually brought into that bank to be a change agent. They were trying to do digital transformation within their bank. And this is like the early 2000 teens. And you can see the highlighted or the bolded things here are kind of interesting because a lot of it is about outputs that are intended to support the movement of this bank toward much more digital, use of digital products and services and things. But that's not really the point of it. The point is that all of those things listed with bullet points are outputs. So we start with accomplishments or outputs. What are the outputs that we need to have once this change or this thing is implemented? And so once we've got that and we've defined the behavior for producing it, for producing whatever those outputs are, how do we ensure implementation and sustainment? And that's really the topic of this session. So this is where, for me, the 6 boxes model really first emerged. And a little history of that. I was a basic behavior science researcher, studied with B.F. Skinner, worked for 10 years in a laboratory, but it moved very quickly from a human lab with people with disabilities as our learners or subjects in the Hoffman Conditioning Lab, actually, into a classroom that I managed for about 9 years. It was a research classroom where we were among the earlier developers of precision teaching with severely disabled people who had an institutional residence. And then I wound up going all over the country and stuff, training precision teachers and training master students. This was the 70s and 80s. But toward the end of the 70s, Ogden Lindsley, who was a major mentor of mine and one of the founders of precision teaching, said, I want you to go into business. And so I went into business, and I didn't know anything about it. But the first thing we did was we kind of fell into applying what we'd learned from precision teaching to do what we then called fluency-based instruction with salespeople in banks. And so we had an environment in the late 70s, early 80s, where banks had been deregulated, and now people who used to be loan officers could become salespeople. because the banks could sell various products and services that they had not been able to sell before. It used to be you were a loan officer and somebody would come in and say, we need a loan. And then you'd go through the process of assessing their fitness for the loan and all that. But they were not really salespeople. Now they had people who could be proactively salespeople. And so we got involved with applying our fluency-based instructional approach with bankers to learn so-called product knowledge, to become fluent in asking questions and responding to questions and talking about asking questions that would lead to description of needs, and then showing how the features of the products that they offered could address those needs. Essentially, a very fluent verbal repertoire. But what was involved with it was practice. It was very different from classic, corporate or anybody training among adults. The classroom setting looked much more like a gym, because what we had is people with things like question and answer practice, or just flashcard stuff where you might have a customer need on the front and a feature of the product in the back, and you needed to get so you could go through those. So it was just second nature. So you could maybe go through those cards at 60 or 70 a minute, just bang, you knew what the features are that you offered to address needs. Or we might have practice where people would be asked a complex question or be given an objection, and they needed to make certain key points in their own words, covering those points in a compelling way, in order to respond succinctly and clearly at the same pace we used to say as they talk about their mother-in-law or their friend. In other words, comfortable, confident conversational pace. Or we would have people who, as we moved into customer service environments where people had to do all that stuff, but they also had to operate systems, we had people practicing with those systems. Now, at that point, two things were important. One is I'd become introduced to Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, which was the same 6 categories as this framework, but it was a language that people didn't necessarily find self-explanatory. And also, what we realized was that this practice couldn't just happen in the classroom. So we had to have classroom activities, and then we had to set expectations that salespeople, that these busy bankers, salespeople in banks, would actually do daily practice with their cards and Q&A exercises and some practice sheets and all kind of stuff. Now, that doesn't usually kind of fit into the typical business person's calendar. So it was a huge change, but it was really implementation planning. So what we had to do was arrange conditions to be sure that on the job, the managers of those salespeople would say, hey, how you doing with that practice? And they'd give them feedback, and they would allocate time. And we were sure that the materials they had worked easily. And we wanted to make it fun. And we had, personal bests. We worked, when we got outside of banks and started working in other industries, like, for example, biotechnology, where salespeople were pretty competitive. We would have people in classroom settings standing on their chairs, shouting answers to things that were flashed up on the screen, wanting to kind of win the contest. So the point is, though, that we had to arrange conditions to make a very different kind of learning occur. Now, the upshot of it was that we just knocked the tops off of any previous training they'd ever seen. And this is my second company, Product Knowledge Systems, came out of that. And subsequently, we were hired by companies like Microsoft and Genentech and others to do major product launches. But in order to get that to happen, we had to arrange conditions to be sure that people would do this stuff when they weren't in a classroom, when we couldn't say, hey, do this. They were on their own. So at that point, that and Gilbert's model came together for me, because what we realized was, we needed to set clear expectations and provide feedback and all the rest of it. Gilbert's language was hard to understand for many people. So that's where this language came from. The 6 boxes language came from kind of several years of trying stuff out, user testing it, until we finally came up with this toward the end of the 80s. But that was my first real application in performance improvement, and it was implementation planning, and it really was change management. So that's what it always kind of meant to me. I always thought that was a big application. Now, I have to mention that these days now, even though it's not that big a deal. But a few years ago at the International Society for Performance Improvement conference, one of my colleagues, unbeknownst to me, had a session where he had people nominate and vote for the best performance model in the world. And guess what? As you can see, the 6 boxes model won by a landslide in the vote, which is not that big of a deal, but I think it attests to the fact that it's practical and usable and it makes sense to people. And you may not be able to see the details in this, but this is one example of one of our job aids where we call these the positive behavior influences in the 6 boxes or enablers. So, if you're trying to put together a system of behavior influence in your company or your department, your organization, your team, that makes it likely that people will learn and acquire new behavior and then that they will keep doing it, that it will sustain. Look at these bullet points, and most of this stuff, the better you can do with putting these things all in alignment, the more likely, you'll get what you need. So that's kind of a framework that we use. And we follow a logic when we do this. We teach this as performance improvement logic, where we say, at the beginning of whatever the change management implementation planning project is, we want to be sure we know what we're trying to do here. Why are we doing this? Is this about increased revenue or productivity, or is it about better, customer satisfaction or employee engagement? Is it about safety? There's a lot of reasons we might be putting something in place or doing change management. So let's be sure we know what that is with our stakeholders. And now let's look at this. Is it a process? Is it a role? Is it a set of things that have to be produced? But, if this thing we're implementing is successful, what are the outputs that will be involved? And are we sure they contribute to business results, which is what that little circle is? This is the core of it. This is we anchor everything once we know what those valuable outputs are, because then it's pretty straightforward to figure out what the behavior is. You can do task analysis, you can observe successful performers, etc. And then you can measure, because those are the three things you can measure, behavior, work outputs. You can count good ones and ones that aren't so good. And you can also usually count and measure business results. And once we know kind of how we're going to measure this, we then look at the behavior influences. And this is where the factors for both implementation and then change management or sustainment happen. Because what we want to do is, what are the conditions maybe that are now in place? Let's analyze. Let's brainstorm possible improvements in each of the cells of the model. And then let's choose the combination of things that we think is most likely to be successful. And then let's implement them. And as I mentioned earlier, I know this is not often allowed in some organizations, but if you're not given the opportunity to continuously improve, good luck on that one. Then, because my experience is we never get it 100% right. We can always find better ways to improve. And then finally, as I always say, because of the plain English of our stuff, we can share this language, which actually helps in change management and implementation planning, because people can, without even know they're talking about, a jargon or whatever, you can say, well, our expectations are really clear on this. Let's be clear, team, about this. Why are we doing this? And what do we expect from you? So that's the logic we go through. And of course, we can measure these things. My experience is that it's easiest if we can measure some critical work outputs, because you can count them. And if you define criteria for good ones, it's a heck of a lot easier than measuring behavior usually. And organizational results are important to measure, like revenue and profit and productivity and all that. But those are kind of lagging indicators, and we want a more leading indicator. So we can count work outputs is often the best way to do it. And here's just, you can hardly read this, but these are just examples of graphs, charts of each of those kinds of things. So we know we can do that. So let me just give you an example, and then we're going to have a bunch of time, and we'll see if you guys have. I hope this spurs some conversation. But this is just a very simple example that I want to show you, and it's actually about implementing a new coaching program. Now, I don't know how many of you have engaged in trying to put a coaching program in place in companies, but what I've noticed is that first of all, it's a big change because it requires people to allocate time to spending time with their direct reports or whoever it is they're coaching to really engage, And the other thing about it is, and I've failed at this a few times, we've brought a coaching methodology into big organizations, trained up the people, got everybody expecting this is what you do. And then by not really being effective at the change management part of it or the sustainment part of it, what we found is that it tends to fall to when you got a performance problem. And that's not it. Coaching is, you can sometimes address performance problems with coaching, but the way we would like to propose it in organizations that we work with, this is a continuous improvement, proactive, continuous talent development methodology. This is not something you pull out when you got a problem. You hopefully get ahead of it by continuously developing people. So it's not a trivial situation. It's a situation where you got to think through, how can you get this thing to happen in the way that you'd like it to? How can you not only get it up to speed, implement it, but also sustain it? So in the process, in what we teach, our particular coaching process, these are some of the critical outputs that individuals need to produce. First of all, they learn how to do individual performance maps, and they got to have practice doing that so they can get pretty good. I can sit down with my direct report. Probably the first meeting is going to take like an hour, which is a big chunk of time. But once we have a pretty crisp definition of your outputs, now our coaching can always be about that. It can be about improving or developing some of those, or adding some for the next big project or for your next career path level. So individual performance maps. And then shared decisions, like how do you ensure that the coach and the person being coached can fairly quickly come up with a decision about what we should work on. And that can be made clear with some criteria and some sort of an algorithm, if you will. And then how do we get clear between us, the coach and the coachee, about what behavior is needed to produce the work output we select to work on? And how crisp and clear can we get on that? And then also, let's take a look at the current existing behavior influences, if they exist, and summarize that, do our analysis, and then do some brainstorming. And then at the end of all that, agreed upon action steps are where the rubber hits the road. It's like you and I talk about this, and then over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to go talk to the training department because I think they've got a module that will be helpful for you. And you ought to go spend some time with Jack, because Jack is really good at this, and you'll see how he does it. And probably we're going to have when we check in every couple of days, I'll give you a little bit more feedback and ask you to show me some examples, blah, blah, blah. So that's those are critical parts of this coaching process, and those are outputs. Yeah, that's Irwin's comment is very important. A lot of, and I think that if people are looking in the chat box there, I just noticed it, that, Irwin says, to many employees and managers, being coached to see as a red career is a red flag, basically. And that is, in my opinion, because it has not been put in place as a proactive, ongoing, how we do things around here. Because the organizations that I've seen where we always check in every week to 2 weeks, and we see what we can develop and improve, and how you're doing, and how's your development plan going, and all that. I think when that starts to become the vocabulary, coaching is not sort of pulled out of the bag as an exception. But that comment, I think, and I may be wrong about it, I may be misunderstanding you, Ron, but I think that comment is very much a symptom, or what happens there is very much a symptom of organizations that have not fully engaged this and lined it up with the values of our organization, which is that we care a lot about people. We maybe even are a servant leadership company or something like that. We focus on continuous development. So that's the reason we're having these conversations, not because you got a problem. But anyway, those are some of the outputs. And so some of the behavior influences, I think of them as in two buckets, if you will, although I think it's ultimately one bucket. But what do we set up before and during the implementation of it? And then what do we arrange so that ongoing it happens the way it's intended to? And so here's a simple picture of, not maybe all of them, but this is the things that we tend to come up with when we speak with a particular client who's trying to implement this. We want to, first of all, executives communicating about this and about how we're going to do it. And then ideally we have beforehand some meetings across levels and silos to set some expectations, that it's proactive, that this is really about helping to develop people, that we're going to that it's important enough to us and to the senior executives and to the folks, the people in this organization, to recognize that each one of us needs to develop in our own path, that the old sheep dip training approach is probably not going to work very well anymore because things change too quickly, and that we want to devote a significant amount of our time, maybe 10% even of a manager's time, to working with her or his people to continuously help them get better at their jobs and to expand their capabilities. And we want to be sure that this isn't something you just do periodically just because you got a problem, but at least one session every 2 weeks. That's the minimum we're going to expect everybody to do, and we want people will arrange conditions. Just as a side note, one of the best examples I ever saw of a leader / manager taking this kind of thing into account was. We're actually implementing this program in a company, and we had in the first group some director level folks and some managers also who worked for some of those directors. And one of the directors said a very smart thing. I think he said, I'm telling my people that my managers, that they're managing other folks, that I want them to spend about 10% of their time on this, on developing their people. And he said, and I'm telling them repeatedly, if this is hard, if you can't find the time to do this, I don't expect you to work late on Fridays or on weekends. Come to me, and we'll readjust your priorities in a way that that allows you to have that much time, because we think it's a high priority. Now, of course, that has to be aligned all the way up and down, because if senior executives say, "What do you mean? You can't take time away from working on widgets," then you got a problem. But that's why communications up and down across levels. Also, every manager has a scripted one-to-one. That is, every manager has, and when we say scripted, we mean some key points. Have discussions with each one of your folks in your one-to-one about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and hear back from them how they're feeling about it. And then we'll meet and figure out if there's any ways we can address any of the concerns you've heard. Frequent feedback for success. So if you have a coaching session and you agree on something with the person you're coaching, or you give feedback. You say, "Oh, that's really good. I saw this week you're getting much better at those requirements documents," or whatever it is. Measurement, just monitoring the outputs to see if we're actually getting what we want. And then ongoing feedback for coaches and employees who improve their work outputs. So that's just box one. And in a lot of change management methodologies, people refer to communication plans, and that's a big part of box one. And then I don't want to go through all the details here, but the tools and resources, there's some things, and I'll show you an example of an implementation planning checklist, but there's a bunch of tools that people are using as part of both the coaching thing that we're implementing. And notice it says easy to use online system. We've hopefully tested this and been sure that it's as, we've selected a system which is moderately intuitive, and it does not itself present an obstacle. And then this is almost a cultural intervention, but managers view as a resource. The manager is not the person that sort of beats me up and gives me a hard time. The manager is somebody I can go to. And, for example, I know one of the people, I will not mention her name, but one of the people who's with us today is an extraordinary manager for the people that she manages, because she's a resource. People can go to her. She supports her people. And so maybe all of you are like that, but you all know, I'm sure, managers who view it as an important part of their job to help other folks perform well and be happy about their work. And then the notion of community of practice is something that in almost every organization that I've seen that adopts anything like a coaching program, we need to put together a context in which, whether it's optional brown bag lunches or periodic meetings in the team or the department where everybody gets together and asks how it's going and shares information. But again, that's if we're going to do this, we're going to devote some resources and time to it. And then realistic time allocation, and then consequences and recognition at all levels, informal and formal. Obviously, we need skills and knowledge, both for the people who are being coached and the coaches. And we can do that not just by training, but with job aids and so forth. And then, of course, another thing that is common in many change management kind of methodologies is you roll out a program or a new system or a new process or whatever it is, maybe one department or group at a time. So you begin with some people who are potential champions and change agents who are respected by others, and you want to get them on board. You may even, some organizations go so far as to have different departments or teams submit little proposals about why you should work with us first, why we want to do it. And that kind of lets people self-select for wanting to be leaders in whatever the change is. And then also an alignment with the company values, explicitly stated values. And there's very few of these interventions, it seems to me, that shouldn't be explicitly aligned with whatever it is we have the executives always talking about or on the wall. And then, early adopters, again, we select people to be sort of in the first wave based on their people skills, based on their ability to be models. And then finally, in motives and preferences, from the very earliest communication about this, we're explicit about values and about why it's helpful to people and why we want to help you develop as an individual. We select champions and exchange agents who are clearly aligned with this and are known even to sort of manifest the values of the organization. And we continuously communicate about how this is making a difference. So this is just a set of examples, but it's how you can think about it as a system of behavior influences. And it's the way I think about it. Now, here's a checklist. You maybe can't read this very well, but a few of you have actually been in companies, are in companies where we've implemented either our coaching program or our practitioner program. And what you may know is that we have this checklist that we share with the stakeholders or the leaders of an effort, which first of all has some stuff about pre-existing conditions. And then during the initial training, it's often a training experience, how do we set expectations and provide feedback? What tools and resources do people have? What consequences or recognition are there? Because we focus on the top row when it comes to this stuff. And then on the job, how are expectations communicated? How do we, particularly early on, provide feedback to people who are coming up to speed on whatever the thing is? What tools do we give them? We want to be sure that the online tools are there, that if we want to create a community of practice, we want to be sure that there's something like a SharePoint site where people share examples, etc. The point is, this is not you must do this. Notice the way this is created. It has a question. Do participants' job descriptions clearly indicate responsibility for developing employees' performance? That is, for example, the managers. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. If they don't, if the answer is no, how are we going to address that? And so the intention here is to use something like this as a conversation piece with senior management and the stakeholders involved, the senior, managers and so forth, not to rigidly insist how they do it, but to say these are all factors that will make a difference in the initial uptake and then sustainment of this thing with your people. And so how are we going to accomplish these things? How many of these things are true now that we can leverage? And how many of these questions raise issues that you hadn't thought of, but we could make happen? So that's a framework for sort of fleshing out the 6 boxes model. And what I would say in the end, if we go back to the ADKAR thing, is that these first 4 bits are kind of the implementation planning part in a way, but we don't have to talk about implementation planning and change management separately, but they're kind of the first 3 are described as the enablement zone, and then the engagement zone. And that's, Erwin mentioned of that, but that's where consequences make a big difference. But I would say it's more than just consequences, because I would say that if you take the original definition in the ADKAR thing of use positive feedback, rewards, and recognition, that's all great. That's really important. But I think it makes much more sense to add expectations, feedback, be sure the tools are working, be sure that people have the time, and then, of course, recognition and rewards, and that people are skilled. So I would argue that whether we call it change management, implementation planning, rolling out a new thing, whatever we want to call it, that basically we look at all these factors as what's going to sustain them once people are in place. So here's a few comments, and then we'll have a few minutes. And I hope you guys will have questions or comments or pushbacks or whatever you want. But first thing is, I think if you look at a new initiative or a new policy or a new system, you define the outputs and the behavior needed, and then you you think of it as a seamless integration of behavior influences using, and I think the 6 boxes model works pretty darn well, goes all the way from initial announcement to ongoing support. This all ought to work together. It shouldn't be some like separate thing. One of the best examples that I have in my history was a coincidental one of working in a call center where the head of the call center was not a big fan of the training department. And so he made a decision that his lead customer service reps were actually going to be the trainers. And so we taught them how to manage practice activities and such, and they did a great job. And what was so cool about it wasn't like you go to the training room and you do some training and then you come over to your job and there's other people in charge. That from the very beginning, you had the same leads who were functioning as coaches and sort of as managers, setting expectations, providing feedback, recognition, support. So that made it seamless in a way that it seldom happens if you're handing people off from training to operations. And then I would say you want to set this up in a way that you can drive incremental continuous performance improvement, because it never works perfectly the first time. And one of the beauties of the 6 boxes model is you can look at the cells and you can do essentially, spot check root cause analysis kind of things. You say, wait a minute, people are still going back to the old system. What can we do about that? Well, maybe you turn off the old system, or maybe you make something about the new system better, or whatever. Maybe set up a competition for which department can do more of this. Whatever it is, you can continuously improve it. And the 6 boxes model gives you a framework for identifying those variables. And then this is just something that always bugs me, so I thought I would stick it in here. In the old days, certainly, when I used to work as a consultant to large companies before I mostly moved into coaching other people through projects, I would find them implementing Oracle or SAP or one of these big systems. And the same thing I see in behavioral health organizations now with their practice management systems, that the companies come in, that the providers of these software systems, and the organizations tend to kind of squish how they do things into the systems. And maybe that's necessary in some cases. But what happens then is that the processes or the performance, the way we do things around here, gets distorted by the software because it's sort of thought of as we're going to implement the software. And I would like to at least encourage people to think of it as, no, we're going to implement a process or a revised process or some new performance. And then we're going to configure software to provide support largely in what I would call box 2, tools and resources, but maybe in providing feedback and setting expectations as well. So it's just kind of they would say mindset these days, but I think it's a mistake to think about implementing software. I think it makes much more sense to say we're implementing or supporting a process or a hunk of performance, and this software is an enabler for that. And so I think then, if you do all this, and if you think about it through the 6 boxes lens, it lays a foundation for continuous improvement. So that's my spiel. What do you guys think? Let's see what else we got here. Scott, I mean all the conditions. I mean the whole 6 boxes thing. So Scott's comment, I wasn't looking at the chat box because I was blathering at my slides, but um, yes, engagement methods are needed, Erwin, without a doubt, and those can mean a lot of different things. But I think in many cases, it can involve something like a community of practice. It can involve small team adoptions. It's a whole bunch of things. I would be actually interested in what different forms of engagement method you might have in mind when you use that phrase. And then responding to Scott's comment, yeah, when I say conditions, I mean the whole 6 boxes as much as possible, which hopefully made sense after I got to the last few slides. Yes, Erwin's exactly right. They don't necessarily come. That's a really good point. The behavior influences don't necessarily come in the sequence of the boxes. It's absolutely correct. Yes, I think there's a toolkit for change. And the thing about the 6 boxes to me is that, first of all, it's simple. There's not 27 categories. There's 6. That's within most of our chunking limits. Secondly, it all makes sense because you got the stuff in the environment, and it's really the top row that you're focused on, at least in terms of sustainment. Now, obviously, the bottom row is critical in terms of planning because you want to be sure you've got to, if people need to learn skills or knowledge or have access to those things, and you can't handle it just with job aids and box two type of stuff, you definitely want to have a, effective instruction and training. My slightly cynical observation at a lot of change management methodologies is that people do the training and then they say, okay, go do it, and they have a communication plan. And so I think often the training part, whatever the skill acquisition part, is often handled moderately well. But I'm not sure if the top row, in terms of expectations and feedback, in terms of the tools really being in place and usable, in terms of lots of recognition of success incrementally, that stuff is often just not embedded in how people do it very well. And that is maybe what you mean, Erwin, by engagement. So say more about engagement if you can, Erwin, what you mean by engagement methods. And I think you're the only one so far who's successfully been able to raise your hand and get me to approve that you could talk, but I'd be happy to do it. Okay, here's Scott with a comment. Communication training seem like the workhorses. Yes. Their antecedents behavior. Yes. Yes, as Aubrey Daniel says, antecedents get behavior going, but consequences keep it going. Another thing he used to say is, you can tell people to do something, but if nothing good happens after they do it, they're not going to pay attention to you anymore. But that's exactly true. So what do you guys think? I mean, how is this a valuable way to think about maybe taking whatever existing change management methodology you have and sort of using this as a tool in the midst of it? Anyone? So Erwin says, okay, with AI, right. Yeah, so that's interesting. AI comment, Erwin. Current issue, right? Everybody's worried about their jobs going away, which I find fascinating in a way because my little tiny playing with AI has said, "Oh no, it actually makes me a lot more productive," and maybe that will make some lower level role outputs go away. But it should enable us to have both the time and the tools to produce other stuff. So I think that's I think, I mean, I don't pay that close of attention to how everybody's talking about this, and I know everybody's freaked out about it, and I keep seeing publications that say, well, in X number of years, 70% of the jobs will be different or eliminated or something like that. But I just keep thinking, yeah, but what are some of the new things that will be possible? Like if we have super good AI for diagnosing medical problems, I don't think that means we're going to need less doctors. I think it probably means that doctors can treat more patients more effectively. Um, we'll use Shelley's comment. Let's see what she says. AI use needs to go beyond how to make a day go. Yes, how I can use it to inform strategy. Absolutely, I agree. I did. This is sort of a side note. We got to quit in a minute here, but your comment, Shelley, reminds me of the fact that at the ISPI conference, which was a couple months ago, there was a lot of discussion about AI. An awful lot of it was just what is it and is it really intelligence and all that, which I didn't find that interesting. But it cranked me up a little bit to try stuff. And one of the couple things I did with Claude and then ChatGPT did things like said, give me a list of 100 ways in the workplace you can set expectations. And it immediately gave me this beautiful list of 100 items categorized into like, is it documentation? Is it something the leader says? Is it beautiful brainstorming tool? Probably better than I could ever brainstorm and given all day. And so I was just struck from that. Thank you, Christina. I was just struck from that this would enhance and accelerate my ability to do stuff, not get in the way. Anyway, I think we're at the end here. You can definitely need $6 to help manage a change, help speed up the process of moving the feelings people have with the change. I think that's right, Stephanie. And I think I think a lot of the times that the reason people are not engaged, if you look at the reasons that people are not engaged, like whether it's you're using a Gallup poll or something else, it's very often it's just missing things in the 6 boxes. They're given conflicting expectations, or they're asked to do something and then the tool to use it or the process really sucks and it gets in their way, or nobody says good job when they try really hard and are successful, or mostly they get negative feedback, or etc. And you can kind of, if you line that stuff up in the 6 boxes framework and say we want everything to be aligned and positive, and you get a leadership and management team in place who is willing to do that, you can continuously improve it. So, okay, I think we're done for the day. Thank you for your comments. I hope this was useful or interesting to you. And I'm really looking forward to next month because I think it's going to be fun to try to persuade people that MBAs should be learning about performance improvement. So thank you, everybody.